Thank you very much. Thank you. So before I begin, I think I should warn you that I generally, when I'm in my classes in America, I generally am standing when I'm lecturing, in most cases, and also I tend to speak off an outline. So if I suddenly stand up, don't be startled. And if I diverge wildly from my point, don't be surprised. These are the things that I'm accustomed to doing. So I really would like to thank those who brought me here. So first of all, I want to thank the Fulbright Scholars Program for funding my research here in Uganda. And I also want to thank my home university, Troy University, which is over there on the left, for supporting me and allowing me the freedom to travel. And they've been very, very supportive. I've been so pleased. I'd like to thank Makerere University for hiring me. I see we had some of the staff at Makerere wander in here to cause trouble as infiltrators, no doubt. Really, this kind of gracious welcome from Makerere University for welcoming here to a beautiful campus, and particularly the U.S. Studies Center, which I will call the U.S. Studies Center throughout because to say the Great Lakes Center for the Study of the United States at Makerere University is maybe a little bit too much of a mouthful for me. So I'll just say the U.S. Studies Center. But we will all know who the gracious host here is, about whom I'm speaking today. So of course, you know, it's customary to begin a talk by thanking your hosts or those who funded it. But as you're going to hear today, this is more than an expression of my gratitude. It's also actually an important part of my argument that I'm making. In addition to helping you understand what the term global medieval literature means, I'm going to trace in some detail how financial and institutional support has elevated some traditions more than others, and how the partnership that brings me here today, including the U.S. State Department, Troy University, Makerere University, and Makerere University, is an important corrective to that problem. I'm also going to point out how one particular scholar from this university has contributed to the global understanding of oral literature. I should say, I thought that would be, as we get to that later, I thought that would be something that only the literature department would know, but apparently it's well known here, so I may be telling you something you already know. Please forgive me if that's the case. I'll assume that you are first-year students and don't know any better. And I'm going to explain to you how the core values, even of this center here that invited me here today, really coincide with the global medieval project. Not just my project, but broadly speaking, what we do when we're doing global medieval literature. Okay, so I think it might be important and necessary to discuss what exactly we mean when we use the term medieval. The term comes from a Latin phrase, medium aevum, which literally means medium, middle, aevum, age, the middle age, which is why we sometimes use the term as synonymous with the Middle Ages. So Middle Ages and medieval literally are the same word, just one is Latin and the other is English in that case. And so, you know, sometimes when students are studying this in school, they might learn that this is the time between the classical era and the modern era, or in Europe particularly, which we're going to talk about a little bit, between the fall of the Roman Empire and the Renaissance, which is roughly between 500 AD and 1500 AD. I like those two dates because 1,000 years is a nice round number to think about. But from the very beginning, we see some complications with the word medieval. So first of all, it relies really heavily on the word modern, but the word modern is not properly understood about a particular time period. In fact, the word modern comes from the Latin word modernus. People in the classical era, people 2,000 years ago, they called themselves modernists. They called themselves modern. They didn't say we're living in the classical era, they said we're living in the modern era. And people in the Middle Ages, in the medieval era, also called themselves modern. And people in our era call ourselves modern. And so we could guess with some confidence that people in the coming centuries will also call themselves modern as well. So the word modern really just means the most recent time. It's not really referring to a particular time period, but more just the most recent time. Now, some scholars reject the term medieval and prefer the term pre-modern. I actually generally avoid that term if I mean medieval. After all, if we can have, even if, I'm going to question this in a second, but even if we can have utter certainty when the modern era begins, pre-modern wouldn't just include the medieval, it would include every time period before today. You know, the medieval, classical, ancient, even prehistoric times. So as flawed as the term medieval is, it's at least more precise as a description than pre-modern. So if you hear me say the word pre-modern, I generally mean not only the medieval, but anything before the most recent era. So, you know, for define a replacement for medieval, pre-modern is just not going to do. And the medieval is just a tiny sliver of the pre-modern. Now, if you start to research this, you might find other scholars using the term pre-modern to include the term medieval. You know, when they do that, I don't stand up and shout at them. It's a different choice, but I can understand that choice as well. But, you know, even within the European context, the term medieval carries within it the seed of globalism. To begin with, if we decide that the classical era coincides with Greek civilization and the Roman Empire, well then, it's centered in the Mediterranean, not in Europe, including North Africa and the Middle East, and parts of the Asian subcontinent as well. So it's not actually truly, if we start there, it's not even really European, it's only a little bit European. And it doesn't even implicate all of Europe, since Northern Europe was never under Greek influence or Roman control. And Northern Europe was really far more affected by global climate change than by any cultural or political structures that come out of the Mediterranean. It wasn't really influenced by that at all. So if the medieval is between the classical or modern eras, then even in the tightest, most constrained definition we're going to use, parts of Europe, Africa, and Asia are all implicated by that, while other parts of the very same continents are not implicated by that. A more expansive understanding then of the medieval is going to have to conform to the real world particularities of these various spaces. You know, what was happening in the real world in this particular space that we're talking about. The modern era, for example, for the Americas, my homeland, will necessarily begin with the Columbian Exchange, which is not the first time Europeans ended up in the Americas, but the first time the Europeans ended up in the Americas in a sustained way. For China, on the other where I've done a lot of work, the medieval period is marked by the rise and fall of certain dynasties. It has nothing to do with the Columbian Exchange. And with some scholars beginning the Chinese medieval period as early as the fall of the Han Dynasty in the 3rd century, and other scholars marketing as the beginning of the Tang Dynasty in the 7th century. I tend to go with the later date, but there are others who know better than I do. So, but certainly, we mark that by dynasties, not by something going on climate, not by some kind of particular people movement or migration. So in any case, we can really see that the medieval era may begin in different centuries or even in different millennia in different parts of the world. It may begin and end in different times. And it gets even more complicated than that because the modern era might begin in different times in different domains, even in the same region. And what do I mean by domains? Well, let me give an example here. the beginning of modern warfare might begin with the widespread use of gunpowder, while the beginning of modern religion might begin with something like the Reformation movement in Europe, for example, right, which will occur at different times. Whereas we can say that in North Africa, the rise of Islam begins the medieval religion for that region, right? So even within one area, different domains you'll enter into what we might think of as medieval warfare or medieval music or medieval religion, added maybe even in different times in the same place. Fortunately, my domain, literature, we actually have a definition for the beginning of modern literature that's pretty good, pretty solid, and thus the end of medieval literature that it's pretty universally accepted, and that is the arrival of the printing press. So literature, we actually are pretty solid with that, unlike some other domains. Now this complicated definition that can change from place to place and from domain to domain raises a really obvious question: what about Ugandan literature? For Uganda, the modern period in almost all domains begins at the exact same historical moment, the arrival of the British. We might be able to make some arguments about the role of Arab traders and other kinds of global influences in other domains, but for literature, that was the moment the printing press arrived. In some places, the forces of modernity came gradually, or more often in little fits and starts. But for Uganda, it all came in one sharp shock. Came all at once, flooding in. And indeed, sometimes I think what is attributed to colonialism is less associated with colonial social structures and more attributed to this sudden, unforeseen arrival of modernity that just showed up on the doorstep one day and insisted on being let in. So you all know this history, but I just want to point it out to you for thinking about modernity in literature. So Henry Morgan Stanley meets Kabaka Mutesa I under the Mawafu tree. You can still see the stump of it at Chamboko, which my colleague there took me to see on my first day here. And that was in 1875, as you all know. Within a couple of years, missionaries began teaching and promoting literacy. Within 2 decades, we see the first school set up, and by the 1870s, missionaries were using the printing press, this tool, this kind of the end of the Middle Ages and beginning of the modern era for literature, to produce materials. By 1900, we see the first English language newspaper, first Mango Notes, and less than a decade later, we see the rise of Uganda and other Ugandan language newspapers, like Abifumu Buganda. In other words, a child, just think about this as a moment of transition and how this wasn't the case in, say, North Africa, this wasn't the case in Asia, and this wasn't the case in Europe. A child born in 1870 would have been born into an oral culture. And by the time the same child is 40 years old, he could be reading newspapers and other texts written in his own language. That's fast. To go from an oral culture to a literate print culture in just a few decades without an intervening manuscript culture, that is, to have things written out by hand, move from oral to manuscript in that way, that's a clear beginning of modern literature, and thus makes our endpoint of medieval literature definite and really without a whole lot of debate. Now, Uganda is not the only country to have undergone such a rapid and recent transformation. It's a common story in the Americas, where I'm from, and sub-Saharan Africa. And most of these places, not just Uganda, but this is true in most of these places, we are faced with an ironic juxtaposition. Even though we're chronologically closer in time to the medieval literature of Uganda than we are in places like England or India or China, we have much less access to it than to the older canons of Europe, Asia, and North Africa. If you were to ask the average person, I found this is true in Uganda as well as as well as in Asia, in North America, to name some works of medieval literature. They might name things like Beowulf, the Canterbury Tales, Dante's Inferno, or the Cameron. All European. No matter where I go in the world, that's kind of where they start. If you were to ask them to name non-European medieval works, I'm forgetting to do these, so you can all get very excited to see pictures finally. If you were to ask them to name non-European medieval works, they'd probably name things like the Arabian Nights, the Tale of Genji, or the various Indian sagas. But typically, to be frank, only specialists will know these texts outside of the ones from one's own homeland. If you were to ask specifically about sub-Saharan African medieval literature, specialists might be able to name maybe the Epic of Sundiata. And if you were to ask specialists of global medieval literature outside of Uganda to name a single medieval Uganda work of literature, the truth is you'd probably get no answer. And if you're very, very lucky, they might make some vague reference to Kintu Inambi. Uganda doesn't really have any representation, even among anthologies of medieval literature that privilege non-Western literature, such as the Norton Anthology series. Now, although it's fashionable to blame colonialism for many African ills, in this case, I don't think we can justify that accusation. Decades of scholars deeply invested in the post-colonial literary theory have not succeeded in raising Uganda's profile. Nor can we put the blame firmly on notions of power coming from secrecy. Pardon my pronunciation, my Luganda is terrible, but I've heard a couple times people try to say, for Luganda literature, akafeche. How is that? Good or bad? You don't even know what I said, do you? That's how bad it was? How bad is it? Help me out here. How would we say this? Yeah. About some cultural knowledge, there really isn't a social system in place to prevent its spread. And indeed, in my own case, I found without exception, that Ugandans are eager to tell and preserve their own stories, whether they're average people or cultural gatekeepers of importance in their kingdoms. Outsiders, particularly Westerners, are eager to learn about these stories and to have them preserved, and Ugandans are eager to have their stories preserved for future generations in their own kingdoms and to showcase their rich culture in the world. So why hasn't it happened? Though all those things are true, then why hasn't it happened? So I really want to focus on two reasons here. The reason I'm focusing on these reasons is I know that here in this is sort of, thank you, the nexus of literature and political science here, and so I'm not going to make specific, policy recommendations. To be frank, I'm not competent to speak in detail about the policies of the Ugandan government, but rather to inform the kinds of things that you might say about that. So the first reason is the least surprising reason: money. Throughout the world, medieval studies receives very little funding, whether it's literary, historical, archaeological, music, religious, whatever the domain, very little funding. Now, in poorer countries, this is really a matter of priorities. When you're having trouble feeding yourself, you may want your education system to focus on agricultural techniques, on basic medicine. Oh my gosh, thank you very much. Look at this. Look at that, very kind. Thank you. Basic medicine, or maybe building a textile industry, right? And while you might really want to provide cultural sustenance for your children, you want to feed your children culturally, first you're concerned with feeding their stomachs and housing them and clothing them. Right? The glories of your ancestral past then can feel like a luxury. However, even when one has the resources, many countries of the world actively discourage the study of the medieval world. So in communist countries, for example, it's viewed with suspicion or even actively repressed as a potential route to counter-revolutionary thought. So in China during the Cultural Revolution, there was a campaign against the Four Olds. If anyone knows anything about Chinese history, you may know about this. Old ideas, old culture, old customs, and old habits. Medieval literature is 3 of those 4 olds. So it's dangerous, and it's not promoted. I myself have lectured and given keynote addresses in China many times, and the only 3 topics I've ever been told not to speak on have been criticism of the Chinese Communist Party, religion, and anything medieval. Because some counter-revolutionary ideas could sneak in there. So in fact, the 2 countries of the world that do the most to support the study of medieval literature are the United States and the United Kingdom. Not only do these 2 countries often financially support medieval studies directly, but they all, like by giving me money to come here, for example, to the State Department. But they also offer a much more stable source of employment for specialists in universities. So even if you're not getting research money for this, to have someone who's employed for decades in the universities, and that's their specialty, this just offers a lot of stability for promoting this. So let me give you some benchmark numbers. Every year in the United States hosts the International Congress on Medieval Studies in Kalamazoo, Michigan. That draws between 2,000 and 3,000 scholars. So every year there's an annual conference there, 2,000 to 3,000 people from around the world come to this. In Leeds, England, every year one's the International Congress on Medieval Studies, the other one is the International Medieval Congress in Leeds, England, which is very confusing. They're not enemies, even though they have the same similar names. That also hosts about 2,000 to 3,000 scholars as well. There is no such large scholarly gathering in any other country in Europe on medieval studies. And the largest one in Asia is probably Mamesak in Korea, typically hosting fewer than 50 members. I've been to that conference a few times, so they're a mighty group, but tiny. And we're comparing 50 to numbers in the thousands. So because these 2 English-speaking countries offer resources to medieval studies, it's really unsurprising that the closer one is to medieval English language literature, the more robust public knowledge is, right? In the English-speaking world, this gets funded the more, and therefore, why does France get good representation? Because they have a strong historical connection to England, and they end up getting studied because of that. And the further away you get from England, the weaker it gets, unfortunately. Now, that's one reason, money, right? The second reason, ironically, for the invisibility of Ugandan medieval literature is, of course, the speed with which the print era came to this region. Many parts of the world went through a period of manuscript culture in which texts were written by hand, often for centuries. In fact, we sometimes in cultures that had a manuscript culture, we often will treat medieval literature and manuscript literature as the same thing. They're not exactly the same thing, but in countries that had a manuscript culture where they were writing, they're pretty close to the same thing. And so when you have several centuries of transition from oral culture to manuscript culture, this gives a great deal of time for a great number of things to be written down. It's just time for them to be written down. And no doubt much is lost in those centuries, but much is also preserved. And so consider if only one major work of literature is preserved per decade over a few centuries, you've got a really robust literary canon, a really robust batch of strong literary tradition. Going suddenly from oral literature to print literature with nothing in between means that the traditional culture of Uganda could have been recorded in print, and it was suddenly competing with other already existing print culture. The oral literature then can seem unimportant or even backwards, while things that are printed in books can somehow seem more authoritative and valuable. So I'm reminded of shopping for mirrors with a colleague in Lithuania during the fall of the Soviet Union. I'm old enough that some of you here are like, Soviet Union, I learned about that in history class, to which I say, shut up. So I was working in Lithuania as the Soviet Union was falling, and we went shopping for mirrors one day. We went to a store, and the store had only 2 mirrors. One was a factory-made mirror, I guess about the size of my hand, with a cheap red plastic backing to it. The other was a full-length mirror with beautiful, ornate, hand-carved wooden frame that must have taken weeks and weeks and weeks to make. That one was only a few dollars. The other one was very expensive. The Lithuanians valued the small cheap mirror because it was plastic and seemed to them more modern. This inversion of values happens all the time when modernity comes in, right? And it can happen in literature as well, as Occult Pipitek suggests in his poems, The Song of What We Know and The Song of Occult. The reason I mentioned Occult Pipitek is that I'm often called Professor Occult here because Ugandans often struggle with my name, although not you. You did very, very well. Ugandans struggle with my name, and one day, soon after I arrived, someone was praying before a meeting, and she stumbled when she said my name, and she actually said Professor Occult. And I think it was Bagume back here said, there it is, that's divine. The name was divinely given in the prayer. He's Professor Occult, so Professor Occult. So Occult Pipitek is close to my heart, so that's why I always use examples from him. Also, by the way, I think he's wonderful as well. Did he go to Makerere University? Did he? I think he did.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think he did, yes.
Yes.
All right, now I'm going to return to a term that I thought the political science people here might not have known. Maybe I'm wrong, so I might be, we have a saying in America, teaching your grandmother to suck eggs. What it means is trying to teach someone better, who knows better than you. So if I'm doing that, my apologies. This term orature, but it was coined here at Makerere University by this Ugandan scholar, Pio Zirimu. I've said his name, I've written his name for years, and only now in the last 3 months I've had to say his name out loud, so my apologies for my pronunciation. And so I think even here I've discovered we're sometimes in the habit of assuming that the theoretical frameworks that we use in literary studies come from Europe or America, and then are filtered out to the rest of the world and adapted there. Here's a case where the opposite's true, where we have a Ugandan intellectual contribution that spread outward into global literary theory, and particularly for us in the medieval world. This word itself insists that oral tradition is not a primitive stage that culture passes through on the way to something better, but a full legitimate literary mode in its own right. He coined it in direct response to assumptions within modern literary studies. I'm going to come back to that distinction in a second, where oral and literary sometimes have been treated as if they belong to entirely different categories of things. Now, for many people working outside of medieval studies, that assumption probably seemed reasonable. But those of us who study pre-modern literature, I say pre-modern because I'm including my friends, the classicists and experts in ancient literature here as well, the idea that oral and literary are opposites never made any sense to us. Quite the opposite, in fact. A large share of the most important literature of the ancient, classical, medieval world, no matter where you are in the world, began as oral transmission. Homer, the Norse sagas, Beowulf, the Sanskrit epics. As we go around the world, we see this. If you threw out everything that started as oral literature, you would completely gut the canon. We'd have very little left to read at that point. So medievalists like me, we've been thinking hard about this for generations. I want to mention two scholars in particular. I'm just going to mention them here, but to sort of show how far back this goes. A guy by the name Milman Parry and Albert Lord. I usually, even though they are they're Parry and Lord, I usually call them Lord and Parry because my professor in undergraduate work called them that, and I can't stop myself, though these decades later, from repeating her order. So in the early 20th century, these two gentlemen, they went to the former Yugoslavia to study oral epic poets. These are singers who could compose thousands of lines of verse in real time, in performance, without a written text. This might sound not so surprising to you. Early 20th century, this was news to them, and they went to study that. And so what they found, of course, was that these singers weren't reciting memorized poems. They were composing and improvising as they went, drawing on a repertoire of formulas, themes, and story patterns. So just before we met today, I met with the head of the Department of Literature, and she was really emphasizing the same point, right? That the performance itself, you lose a lot when you move it from the performance to something written down, right? When Parry and Lord applied that framework to Homer and Beowulf, works that they already knew about, that had long been treated as these kind of monuments to solitary literary genius by one person, they turned out to show all the hallmarks of oral composition. So what does Zerimu's term add to all of that? It doesn't solve a problem that medievalists were having. Instead, it insists to modern scholars, by which I mean not just people living today, but people who are scholars of modern literature, that the insights of Lord and Parry are applicable globally to Uganda as well. Orature, then, is not specifically a Ugandan phenomenon, though of course, he's originally describing Ugandan phenomenon, right? But it's a concept that applies to the whole world, but a concept that then gets refined and the world really receives from right here, not just in Uganda, but here in Makerere. Now, of course, not everyone makes this mistake that Zerimu's correcting. As I mentioned before in Uganda, Professor Okon, look how handsome he is. You knew that a man like that was going to be handsome. And a Choli poet who focuses on this very problem. Individuals struggling to understand what is valuable in the rush of modernity, right? And so much of Ugandan modern, so I use him as an example, but so much of modern Ugandan literature is really about this topic in some way. It might be about individual characters, but about this theme of we were living in one way, suddenly the outside world comes rushing in and brings with it all this modernity. What does that do to what we had before? The valuable things. What are we losing in this? Now, I've met many scholars and storytellers here who are really eager to preserve this rich culture and have recorded and published stories they found. Unfortunately, those have mostly fallen out of print or exist only in archives. We talked about archives a great deal before you came here. But the work has been done. The combination of late documentation, limited print runs, and archival burial means that the material has been effectively invisible in the field once you get outside of Uganda. Not ignored, but unreachable. So my own Fulbright research, which I'm not going to talk about too much here today because I'm here to talk about other things, but this really hopes to use digital publishing to reverse this problem, to take all the work that's been done here and make it permanently available at a price point, also free whenever possible, actually, that students can afford to read. All right, so let's assume for the sake of argument that I'm able to do this, my project is wildly successful, everything is so wonderful. We still have to deal with the central tension in global medieval literary studies, and that is the tension between the universal and the particular. And this is a really important one to consider. Literature, by its nature, is always to some degree universal. Every human culture throughout history, we've all shared this impulse to tell stories, compose poetry, write songs. So, to give an example, every semester I begin teaching world literature by showing my students a poem called "Love How I'd Love to Slip Down to the Pond." I tell them it was written by one of my creative writing students and ask them to analyze it. And this is what we do on the second day. Now this is a poem from the perspective of this young woman, and she's fantasizing about getting the attention of this particular young man down by the pond. Are you all familiar with this poem? Maybe not. It's only in world literature classes do you usually get these. And we talk about the poem for about a half an hour, and I spend a lot of time asking the students what they think about the girl who's writing it. And they usually say, often the young women will say, she seems just like them. Like she seems like someone they know. Occasionally someone will think it's a current student and that they do know this girl. They'll ask if it's so-and-so. Or that they know a girl who's just like her. And then I reveal to the class that I've lied to them. You should never trust me, I will lie to you. If I think it will teach you something, I will tell you a lie. If your question is, was this a bunch of lies? No. Can you trust that? Probably. I lied to them. This poem wasn't written by one of my students, of course. It's a poem from about 1300 BC, ancient Egypt. This girl lived millennia ago in a land that none of my students have ever been to. The whole time I've taught it, I've had one student who'd been to Egypt. And yet, just from reading a few lines of her poetry, they understand her. This is part of the universal nature of literature. As humans, we start with deep insight into other humans. How we think, how we feel, how we use language. Yet, all literature is also particular, shaped by its own language, its own nation, its own religion, its own social structures, its own cultural presuppositions. So a good example of this is early medieval Irish stories. Early medieval Irish stories often glamorize stealing cattle, much like some cultures that you have in East Africa. But my American students struggle to understand these stories because they don't really value cattle that highly as deeply. They're not as important to the American self-understanding. And also because even the students who are not Christian, they have sort of adopted from Christianity a deep religious prohibition on stealing. So first, they don't value the cattle enough, and second, they're like, well, stealing is wrong, stealing is bad. But for us to understand the particulars of those stories, we have to understand the particulars of those cultures. So good global medieval scholarship then has to hold both the universal and the particular at once. It compares things without flattening them out, and it particularizes things. That's hard to say also. Particularizes things without exoticizing them. So I would argue that humility is not just a scholarly virtue, but in my field, a necessity. So here's a good example. The Mayan epic, the Popol Vuh, includes the story of a young woman named Blood Moon. And she's the daughter of one of the death gods. They're called the Death Lords. They're kind of gods, right? She's a kind of god also, a minor god. In it, this young woman, Blood Moon, she approaches a forbidden tree that has growing on it, a skull growing on it as fruit. The skull speaks with her and then spits into her hand and impregnates this virgin girl. It's important she's a virgin. And she becomes pregnant with hero twins who will defeat the gods of death and become the saviors of humanity. If you know your Bible, your first reaction is, well, this looks like an unmistakable case of Christian influence. The fusion of the forbidden fruit of the Garden of Eden with the virgin birth of Jesus. And it seems pretty obvious that the goddess blood moon was mixed with Eve in the Garden of Eden and with Mary, the mother of Jesus. Seems pretty obvious, and I think every single time I've taught this, and when I first encountered it, I thought, well, obviously this is a Christian influence. We know the person who wrote this down also had a strong Christian influence. Except in this case, it's wrong. Archaeology has provided us, this is a cup, this is a kind of image of a cup spread out, a ceremonial cup that depicts this very scene, but was made centuries and centuries before the coming of Christianity to the New World. It seems an undeniable Christian borrowing, and yet we know for a fact that it cannot possibly be one. What looked like a particular borrowing turned out either to be a universal archetype or an incredible coincidence. So for me, the story of Blood Moon here demonstrates the need of Blood Moon, by the way, if you're wondering, that's the center image is really, this is the tree, this is the skull. We have other ones, but this is the best one that predates Christianity. We can sort of see it. For me, this story here demonstrates the need for scholars to be humble before directly, definitively declaring such and such is particular to this culture or such and such is universal. But be really humble about that, because it's often hard to tell, even when it appears obvious. So I want to be clear that global medievalism, as I'm talking about, is not purely theoretical. Scholars are actively doing it, right? And the practice of it looks as much like field work as library research. So let me give you two examples from my own work, because they tell a lot of why I'm here, but you shouldn't take from this that I'm like the world's greatest global medieval scholar. I am not. So as I mentioned before, I received a Fulbright Hayes grant. It's a different kind of Fulbright grant than the one I'm on now, to go to Guatemala to study the Popol Vuh, which we saw an image from, the great Quiche Maya epic. And that's because it was a pre-Columbian creation narrative that sat entirely outside of the European medieval tradition. It has other fascinating things, which I'm not going to talk about today, because we'd go really far outside for time. Well, before you can compare it to anything else, you have to read it on its own terms. And you can't do that from a library at Troy University in Alabama. You have to go. You have to go there. In this case, to the Guatemala Highlands. So I had to go. The second example is Tang Dynasty poetry from China. I wanted to really work seriously in 8th century Chinese verse, and I knew quickly that translation alone was not going to get me there. My Mandarin Chinese is terrible as modern Chinese. It's really bad, and if you don't believe me, I can get someone on the phone right now my Chinese teacher who can tell you, yes, it is terrible. Actually, she would tell you it's wonderful, and then as soon as there's no crowd, she'd say, oh, you're so bad. But I am bad. I can tell you that for truly and honestly. So instead, I hosted a Chinese scholar at Troy University for a year, specifically to teach me the tradition from the inside as someone who has a deep understanding of the language and culture beyond my terrible Mandarin Chinese. By the way, I should say, the COVID pandemic really hurt a lot of academic programs, just damaged a lot of them. Some that were growing just died. Some that existed for a long time were killed. Some new initiatives got stalled. I'm one of the few beneficiaries because she came for a year to study with me, and then she got stuck because of the pandemic. I got a year and a half. So I guess thank you, pandemic, for helping giving me 6 more months of literature. But largely it was damaging. So when you're examining particularity of a tradition, wherever possible, you need to find a guide who comes from within that tradition. For a medieval scholar, usually our authors are usually long dead, but we get as close as we can to their particularities. Uganda is part of that same effort for me, an encounter that works best, get here. An encounter that works best as a partnership. The outsider, me in this case, actually brings something real to the table. Freedom from local assumptions that can allow the outsider something fascinating, to see something fascinating in this work of literature that the insider just sees as normal. Well, that's normal, right? Well, maybe it's not, right? The insider, of course, brings something that the outsider can never have. The language, the cultural context, the relationships, the ability to hear what the tradition is actually saying rather than what the outsider expects it to say. This is, I think, one of the problems why we misunderstand Blood Moon is we expect it to say something and then we recognize our expectations in it rather than the reality. Neither one alone does the job fully. The outsider alone risks flattening the particular into something familiar. So, if we go back and look at the first works of medieval literature, we see that happens a lot, where the outsider wants to make something fit into a tradition that he or she knows well. The insider working alone often will have trouble seeing what's universal, right, and therefore valuable, to the wider world. Together, they can hold both of these at once, which is exactly what good medieval scholarship requires. And it doesn't even have to happen in the same generation as long as they have a shared text. So in fact, we've actually had a lot of good, what I mean by this, doesn't have to be in the same generation, is we have some good scholarship where someone will come, usually some outsider will come, and they'll present some work of literature, and they'll record it, and it gets put down, and decades later after they're dead, someone else comes along and says, hey, you misunderstood that. And they don't do something new, they do a corrective on what exists before, and between the two of them, they can actually build a deeper understanding, even though they never knew one another. That's why I came here to Uganda, to Makerere University. Ugandan orature really presents, for me, a challenge that neither Guatemala nor China did, because in those cases, the tradition is accessible in books written by people who are long dead. Here, the tradition is barely accessible with books, and until it is, this Ugandan tradition of orature is often invisible abroad. The question then arises, what will happen if we're able to change that? If Uganda takes its proper place in world culture? Well, for that, I want to go back to the great poet and editor of the 20th century, a guy by the name of T.S. Eliot. Do you teach T.S. Eliot here? Is he a familiar figure in Ugandan literature departments or no?
We do.
You do? Okay. Mm-hmm. So I may be telling you something you already know. Those who are unfamiliar with him, he was a major 20th century poet, critic, and editor. He really helped shape the modernist literature, what we think of as the modernist voice from the 20th century. And his writer is best known for poems like The Wasteland and The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, who I just realized, I asked if you knew this, and I just realized I walked in on two colleagues earlier this week arguing about The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, so at least some people are familiar with it here. And so he influenced both sides. And the United States can become a culturally richer civilization from its relationship with Uganda. And Uganda can become a culturally richer civilization from its relationship with the United States, civilizational rationality. By the way, we see this all over the place, where this actually, we know that this works this way. In 1776, 250 years ago, Adam Smith wrote the book The Wealth of Nations, arguing that trade between nations is not a zero-sum game, but makes both nations prosperous. Right? If your country needs apples, and my country sells apples, and you buy apples, it actually improves both countries. T.S. Eliot made the same argument for art. The individual artist is enriched by the tradition of the ancestors, and each affects the other. Here, the U.S. Studies Center makes the argument again, broadly from the political realm, though we have the political, art, and social sciences, other social sciences here, The intellectual partnership and exchange will benefit both civilizations. I'm using both. I do think probably we're talking about multiple civilizations here in the Great Lakes region, but I'll just use that way. So in my own tiny way, my own small way, my work here in Uganda, accords with these ideas and contributes to the field of medieval studies. And if you will allow me to get to an idea, it'll take a second to get there, but this is an idea that medievalists, I found, know, but most people who don't do medieval literature have not considered this. It's something you all realize, but you maybe could intellectually understand, but never thought of it before. So I'm going to start from this year, 1776. That's the year the Declaration of Independence was written in my country. It's a quarter of a millennium old this year. Happy birthday to it. And its preamble, it asserts that all men are created equal. This is a claim of a divinely given dignity and value to every single human being. Now, as an American, this is my own American bias, that creed is really in the very marrow of my bones. But as a medieval scholar, let me point out that that creed is not merely true in the present and the future, which is how we often think about it, but in the past, when it was not widely recognized. Let's do some math. Sorry, some of you are like, we're social scientists and literature people, we don't know math. It's easy math, okay? Don't worry. Each one of us here has a mother and a father. We have 2 ancestors, 1 generation back. We have 4 grandparents, 4 ancestors, 8 grandparents, 8 ancestors, and so on. Every generation you trace backward from yourself, that grows exponentially. When we get back to about 800 years ago, not 8,000, 800 years ago, okay, during the medieval era for most of the world, including here, the number of ancestors that everyone here has is greater than the population of the world was at that time. Let's pause for a second and consider what that means, right? Your number of ancestors 800 years ago is greater than the number of people that were alive at that time. Now, the math is actually slightly messier than that for a couple reasons. One is cousin marriages, which you can reduce the number of ancestors you have, cousin marriages in insular societies. And also, most people who lived in the past had no descendants, so that actually works the other way. It makes us get to that number more quickly, and because we can't trace, at some point we can't actually trace the names of our ancestors back, but we can do the math. Roughly speaking here then, there's an excellent chance that every person sitting here today, you, me, we share common ancestors who lived in the medieval era. You might not have considered that mathematical. It's more likely than not that you and I have common ancestors from 1,000 years ago. Not 10,000, but 1,000, right? By the way, every generation back, only increases that probability. When you get to 6,000 years in the past, it's really becoming more and more likely. By the way, at this point, we're getting to math that I'm not good at. So I'm now reporting what I've heard from others, not what I know. 8,000 years ago, almost definitely, we all come from 2 people, the same, all of us in the world, 8,000 years ago. And at around 10,000 years ago, it becomes a mathematical impossibility for us not to share the same ancestors. By the way, if you're wondering, some of you are like, hey, in my religion, we call that an Adam and Eve, or you have something. We actually call these figures genealogical Adam and Eve, the shared ancestors of all of humanity. But certainly, you and I probably have shared ancestors from the Middle Ages. All right. We are then not only created equal, but we have a shared global medieval literary heritage from our shared ancestors. All those other countries I mentioned, like, well, that far off land, guess what? It's true for you and them too. And you also share in their medieval literary heritage. that heritage belongs to all of us, not as a courtesy, not as an act of political inclusion, but simply as a matter of fact. The stories told around fires here in the Great Lakes region 1,000 years ago were told by people who are your ancestors and probably mine too. And the loss of those stories diminishes us both. By the way, that's true for these other works of European or Asian medieval literature that I've mentioned. Your ancestors as well, most likely. So my work here, the work I'm doing in Chambogo, and here today talking, is a small attempt to restore what belongs to all of us, to bring Ugandan orature into the place it has always deserved in the world's literary tradition, and in doing so, to let those traditions change one another. It's what the U.S. Studies Center has been built to foster, and what I hope to do here as well, civilizational relationality. Thank you so much for giving me your time today. I managed to sit through the whole thing. That was pretty amazing.
That's okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Scott, and for your really deep insight into this area of global medieval literature, literary tradition. And I believe that probably raises a number of things for most of the people sitting here and who might want to ask a question or two or more. And we give you the opportunity to do so, please. Both from our students and even our colleagues. Please, you're welcome. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Prof. and members around. My name is Ronald Davine. I'm a student of Public Administration and Management Masters. Yeah, Prof, you hinted about the gaps, or some of the few gaps, in integrating Ugandan orature into the global medieval literature. But one of the issues that is still affecting some of us, I think, is on the issue of when you look at the publication, that to publicize a document, who grants the permission, who has the permission, so that that document is accessed by every person. Is the permission from a Ugandan? Is someone centered in Chambogo or in Makerere to approve? Why is it that there are people from Europe, there are people from the Western areas, not Africa or Uganda? Then actually, I'm very happy that you are one of the people I have seen appreciating that Uganda has done something, or Africa is doing something, or it did something, by appreciating and showing us some of the contributions of the few Africans in terms of this theme we are talking about. Thank you so much.
So this is not something I dealt with here today, although I had an invitation to maybe come talk about this. I've talked about this at Chambogo, and I may return talk about this with the literature department. So a lot of what I'm doing has to do with digital publishing, because why is it that some people can decide who has access and who does not have access? To be honest, that tends not really to be about gatekeeping. It tends to be about money. Who's funding it? It's expensive to print a book. It just is. It's expensive to print a book, and someone's money is at risk. And so, because of that, the person who's paying, we have a saying, he who pays the piper calls the song. If you're paying the musicians, you get to decide what song is being played. And so one of the things I've come here to do, I'm not actually interested in publishing a volume of Ugandan literature with Oxford University Press. Instead, what I'm interested in doing is using open access journals, open access digital publishing, specifically because it increases access and lowers the price. So I had a seminar a few weeks ago with Makerere University where they were talking about like how to build journals using digital publishing, and one of the points I made is the first work, the reason you don't just take something and slap it online and call it digitally published is you need a board of editors. You need a board of editors. And so you're like, why is this person in another country deciding this? Well, if you're using digital publishing, well within the means of not just every Ugandan university, but like I started a little digital publishing company in 2011. 3 owners and employees. We operate on a shoestring budget. I mean, it is very, our labor is almost all of the cost of it. It costs us almost nothing to produce these books. And so what this means is you don't have to worry about who has the money. You can now decide, okay, who has the expertise to be on this committee to make these decisions. You can't publish everything because at some point you're just splashing it everywhere without any kind of real distinction. But I would argue, and I may return and talk about this, that I would argue that digital publishing really has opened up the financial structures so that becomes less of a problem than it is now. And I would also say, by the way, when you have a committee doing almost anything important in a university, it's made up of all members from whatever that department are, and then one outsider. I would also argue that even in those, you will want to have a little bit of outside influence, the outsider to see like, I noticed something that you didn't notice. Sometimes it's called the 10th man, just having the one outsider. But to have this critical mass that's one of Ugandans who are promoting Uganda literature, that's not just reasonable, but now is something I think that can be done.
Thank you very much also for taking interest in Ugandan Orature and devoting time to come and understand it from the source. Mm-hmm. That's very good. I want to clap for you. Yes, you've noted that Ugandan Orature is absent on the global map, mm-hmm. And I just want to draw your attention to the fact that, well, I think the landscape is going to change because, for instance, the professor who was seated next to me, Professor Bashiva, is right now writing the epic of Chintu and Nabi, which is about to be published. And quite a couple of staff are actually documenting all these stories. So something is actually there. And also my other note, something to note is that you gave us a historical marker as the introduction of the printing press, and also, maybe formal education in Uganda. But I wanted to note to you to think about it this way. The introduction of formal education in Uganda did not exactly end the culture of orature, no. And because the culture of orature is actually alive today. So they just live together. And so oral literature lives alongside the modern literature or the written literature in Uganda. And these two are just growing different. One is going this side and one is going the other side. And so if we want to capture that and make it accessible, because now maybe from elsewhere someone thinks Uganda is a desert, there's nothing. But there's quite a lot. So I think the idea of digital publishing is now something that we can think about, but otherwise quite a lot of work is going on. Mm-hmm. That's been going on for a long time. Yes. A lot of many projects have been happening since Makerere was inception, about even 20 years ago. Research was happening in Orature, and all of those records are around. And so it's a matter of putting them up for the public space to be accessible. Otherwise, we cannot now date then, we cannot probably date Ugandan medieval literature and say it began this time because our stories come from afar. I mean, when the story comes to me right now, when we have a popular story called Chintu Ano, we have the story several stories anyway, but one of the stories is the story where an ogre eats a girl who has been hidden in the superman must know the story. Anyway.
I might also know it, by the way.
Yeah, and you know it?
Yeah.
All right. So now, that kind of story comes to you today, but you have no trace of where it began. And we just know that every performer added something to that story, so that by the time it comes to, it could have exactly, changed quite a lot. And you're also likely to find the same story in different versions. Recently, last year, we did a research trying to trace the environmental, and kind of ecological archive in Uganda's folk tales. And the idea was also to compare, because you see, the idea of environmental, preservation and pollution and all of those things were never an issue in Uganda in maybe the last 50 years or something. And so I wanted to see, what do our people have to say? What do we have in our own archive? And then we were surprised that you could go to Butambala and find a story under the same title. The story in Butambala has a title, and you find the same title in Omusete Island, but the two stories have a different plot altogether because different factors will determine what goes in this story. So these stories are drawing from the challenges and problems and experiences of the people in the community, in that performing community. And so, therefore, our tradition of storytelling perhaps is tells you a lot about our history and our challenges and our beliefs. And so, I think for me I can date the origin of Ugandan medieval literature with the origin of the Ugandan communities. But you see, we cannot even say Ugandan literature and have a valid kind of term because we have 56 or more ethnic groups, and each of them has their own literatures. And so, when you talk about Ugandan or literature, you're going to have to, give a disclaimer and let us know that there's nothing called Ugandan or literature, because all of us have our different. I'm in Uganda, and so we have ours. She is something else, and then she has hers, but we're all under the nation called Uganda, which is a colonial construct. Different from the ethnic kind of communities from where people come. So the idea of Ugandan origin, Ugandan medieval literature, all of that is contestable, and then the idea of a particular dating of that kind of literature is also contestable. What you can only perhaps talk about is that each of these communities, their literatures originate from their activities of worship and their incantations and worship music and also worship performances, and all of that dates for as far back as we can even not know maybe the origin of the tribes, the different tribes. And we have our myth, the myth of origin, which talks to you about what people believe to be their origins, and all of that lets you know then that we cannot date the beginning of medieval Ugandan literature or Uganda, you see. But anyway, I think my point is called.
Yeah. So you've given me a lot to respond to. So I'll do it in a messy way, and I'll start off in reverse.
And I also spoke in a messy way.
So in fact, the students here, I hope that you heard what she said. This very idea of particularity and universality is not just global; it applies in Uganda, right? The universality of something found, you've mentioned that we might have this same story in these 56 different ethnic groups. We might have several that have the same universal story, same universal structure, but they also have their own particularities, right? And this idea of particularity does not apply to 19th and 20th century nation states. Right? That's not really how this works. It's actually much more particular than that. much more particular than that, as the professor has, I think, really adequately illustrated. So I would say, you talk about these existing together, and in fact, this is important also for people to remember. So let's just for a moment take a model. It's a common model, not my own, of oral culture, manuscript culture, print culture, digital culture. And I think sometimes when people first encounter this, they say, well, there's a period of oral culture, and then that is superseded by a period of manuscript culture, and that is superseded by print culture, and then digital culture, like this. But in fact, what happens is just like Eliot said, what happens when the new thing comes is the old thing reorganizes around it. Right now, you are listening to me speak to you. That is oral culture.
Mm-hmm.
Right? As people are talking to me, and I'm like making sure I don't lose track of their questions so I can accurately answer it. Manuscript culture. Right? I read because to make sure that I didn't have any problems with internet or electricity. Print culture. Digital culture, right? And so what happens is, it's as that when the new thing is added, it changes how we think about the old thing. So one odd thing that we do today, and I've seen this, I don't know how widespread it is in Uganda, I've done it a few times in Uganda, but I don't know if it's peculiar to American culture. If I have to sign a contract or something, but I have to do so digitally, they'll say, put your name here. But they'll say, type your name here, but it will type in a font that looks like I wrote it by hand. Somehow, we've taken manuscript culture and said that makes something official. That gives something a kind of authority. And so when someone comes into when someone comes into a meeting like this, like there's a book being passed around where you write down who was here. We could theoretically have a secretary type that out. But in fact, we think somehow manuscript culture has taken on this new meaning that it didn't have before, this meaning that this is something of personal authority to me, right? And so, as the professor points out, it isn't that print culture showed up and people stopped talking, or that art that this performance of oral culture stopped. But what happens is each one now takes on its own cultural meaning, and they have a tension and a pull from one to the other. And so as a student, one thing that we often see, for example, from oral culture, is usually if a student is studying a play or a drama, you're studying it in print, even though it was designed for you to watch it, right? For oral transmission. Well, why don't you watch the play? Well, because it's very expensive to get 20 actors together to build a set, and every time you want to do it, to do it over and over again. But when you're reading a play, you as the student need to stop and think, okay, I now have to essentially create in my mind a play out of this. I have to translate it back into oral culture because, frankly, the economics of doing if I'm doing, maybe in one semester I might do 5 plays in a class. If I do 5 plays in the class, I can't afford, my students could never afford tuition if we have to do 5 plays just for my class, not counting the other courses that are being taught, right? And so digital culture has come along and it has changed how we think about print culture. But print culture still means something, right? Print culture still means something. And to the point where someone can say, well, I read it online. And if someone says, I read that online, but that might not mean anything. Well, Does it have necessarily less authority than something that you read in print? Well, not necessarily, but we do take it in that way. And to kind of go from the last point you made to the first point down to the middle, just to quickly address it, you point out that we have no exact origins to these stories. And for modern literature, people who do modern literature, that's really troubling. We like to have the beginning. We like to have the beginning. We like to have the artist, their first draft, or the first print version. But for pre-modern literature, we never have that. We never have it, and we're not never. There's a couple where we do, but like we almost never do. We're very, very comfortable with saying we don't have an origin to this. And so, to give you some examples, from medieval literature, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, he wrote several versions of them. The sequence in which they come, what happens, like big, not small changes, but there are big changes in between them. And so when we give them to modern audiences, we say, here it is. Here's the Canterbury Tales. This is the true thing. But in fact, as editors, we know that it's not the true thing, that there is no kind of original thing. And so when you're dealing with Orature, I'm sure that the professor can attest to this. When you're dealing with Orature, you always have to be cognizant of the fact that any editorial intervention that you make, you have to make them to make them accessible. You're gaining something, but you're losing something. And you always have to be aware that sometimes what you're writing can become, this is the definitive version of it, even though people don't really see what you have done. So this is why it's necessary for translations. There's usually a translator's note in front of a translation to give you the general principle, and that's really helpful, but that's just the general principle. And so we do have to be often comfortable when we get to the pre-modern world with being free from origins, or at least have a free-floating sense of origins. We can't then say that origins don't matter at all. We can't pretend that the story of Chintu and Nambi comes from 19th century Australia or something. Like we can't pretend that. It does have a particularity that matters, but we always have to hold that very, very gently in our hands. I hope I've responded to the issues you were raising.
There was another. Let's start from behind and then come to you, please.
Thank you so very much, Chair. Thank you so very much, Chair. I should like, before I pose my question, that first register these talks, that Makerere continues to be quite a wonderful place. I studied here for my undergrad. I didn't know, Professor, of course, that I would finally get to meet you here.
I've changed a lot since I wrote my great poems.
For one reason, it also helps that the name is Lazarus. The question that I had in mind, and you spoke about this, you mentioned something about publications going out of print.
Yes.
And this got me thinking, because like some of your works here are actually out of print now, and that they're some of the most fundamental works that are valuable to us, even in the sense that whereas the created work, the artistic work is there, that also something that sustains the work going is the practice of theory. As for example, when you're discussing and you kept referring back to T.S. Eliot, even when we know that he did this great work, but also the theorizing that helps to stabilize the work. In our case here, also from your works, that these publications are fast depleting. And so now the question to us in the room is, what then have we done to save, or can we even salvage this? Of course, again, the thing also to think about vis-a-vis Orature in that same regard is again, and I say that to say, because again we're dealing with oral literature, that in societies such as mine, that you realize, because I do not know what the specific reason is, but then you begin to fear that it seems that the language is beginning to die, which then begins to mirror the whole idea of these publications going out of print. In a sense, it is like certain people are going out of print, so to speak. Is there any, this is really to all of us in the room, that could be done in this respect to salvage what we already have, but which is fading away, and then also the potential of actually still documenting ahead while we're losing very quickly.
So, I mean, I mentioned this earlier, so I'll go back to why did I start a digital publishing company in 2011? It wasn't to make money. I assure you, we don't make money. Everything that we make goes back into the company. So, you know, we do make a profit, but that profit is immediately reinvested to do more works, right? There just isn't big money in publishing books. There just isn't, right? So why did we do it other than to frustrate ourselves? Well, it's because there are works that of medieval works that were out of print because in some cases there had been an edition 100 years ago and it's just too expensive to make a new one and not enough people want it. Or some kinds of works are ones that, so I don't want to get too deep into these numbers, but have you ever noticed that almost all books are about 250 to 300 pages long? They're almost all the same length. You can find shorter books and you can find longer books, but if you were to right now go into Aristoc and look at what they have there, you would immediately be like, oh, almost all books are about the same length. I mean, they can be a little shorter and a little longer, but when they start getting much shorter, much longer, the price goes up. That's because that is the sweet spot. 250 to 300 pages, that's the sweet spot for how much work it takes, and I can make the money back so I'm not going to lose money on this book. Well, a lot of works of medieval literature are 30 pages long, maybe 50 pages. There are very few that are 250 pages long. And so when you find them, what you find is there'll be 175 pages of introduction, and then the little bit of the addition of the actual thing you came there for. If you've ever wondered why that is, it's not because, not because the editor is so self-important they want to do this, but they said, no one will buy the book if it's this thin, but costs $80. And so digital publishing allows us to take things that have such a small audience that we can manage to do it, or have an audience that wants it but cannot afford to pay enough, or an audience that, or a work that doesn't fit neatly into the modern print categories. And so what I would say is that some of those things that you're talking about, are generations old and have probably fallen out of any kind of international copyright. They could then be republished in digital publishing and made available cheaper. So my little publishing company, most of our books are either $3 or $4. Well, that's pretty cheap. If you don't believe me, go to Aristoc again and find out. I assure you, that's pretty cheap. That's pretty cheap for a book. Why can we do this? Where we're not losing money on the books, we're actually making a little bit of money on every book, but it's just a cheaper model to be able to do this. And so, so when you think about digital publishing, we could think about like going forward, but why do we do this for medieval literature? Because we're actually going backwards also and taking things from the past. And so I think you can go both directions at once and keep things preserved in that way. Really, I want to be clear, digital publishing is, I'm not here to sell you a magical beans that will grow a beanstalk and bring you great wealth and forever. It has things that you give up. When you move from oral literature to manuscript literature, you give up the performance but you gain the ability for someone who wasn't there to read it, right? When you go from manuscript culture to print culture,